just really grateful to be here. Big thanks to Alexandra Katahakis for having me and inviting me, and the Center for Healthy Sex as well. And so I've definitely been anticipating this opportunity to come and share some lessons that I've learned in helping people recover from sexual addiction, and also through my own recovery and writing. And so today's topic is self-connection skills for long-term recovery. And so what I'm going to share with you is really how self-connection is has a primary role in sexual addiction recovery. And I'm going to share some tools with you and some research. And I think you'll find that this is very practical in nature. And I really do want your questions. So please hang in there and hold those till the end. And then I really do look forward to connecting with you. Okay. Well, this is on self-connection, this talk. And I'm getting practice right now, practicing self-compassion. So there we go. So connection with the self. Really what I want to focus on is that healing our relationship with ourself is a foundational piece of recovery. I think this is something that is easily neglected in recovery. And yet, without healing our relationship with ourself, we really won't be able to achieve long-term recovery. And, I think part of why this is so important, for those of us that struggle with addiction, and really many of us, I think many of us grew up with some type of emotional neglect or abuse or trauma. Maybe we had parents that were addicted themselves, or maybe our parents didn't know how to connect. They hadn't learned that from their parents. And so, many of us come into this world, and just in our early years, we experience a lot of disconnection. We're unable to attach to our caregivers and to ourselves. And I think, even if you're not somebody that struggles with addiction, many of us can relate to that. And so we really learn from our caregivers how to treat ourselves. And I think we often internalize harsh voices towards ourselves. We also learn to emotionally neglect ourselves. The way that our parents do or do not respond to our emotions really teaches us something about our emotions, whether they're something worth paying attention to or not. And, and we also become addicted. For those of us that have struggled with addictions, we also disconnect from ourselves through our addiction. I know for me, like it's a disconnection. Not only has it been a disconnection from my pain and my emotions and, the things going on inside my heart, but also a disconnection from my values and from who I know that I really am. And so I think many of us that have struggled with addiction can really relate to that disconnection from ourselves as a result of the addiction. And just want to mention that this connection with self is very hard work. It's necessary work. And really it's something, I'm actually just next week, I'm celebrating my 15 years in recovery, and I'm excited about that. And I also just want to share with you that that I'm still doing this work. This is a lifetime of recovery. This work is something that we'll be working on our whole lives, and especially when it comes to our relationship with ourself. We're going to have ourself our whole life, and so healing this relationship is really going to be foundational. Again, not just for recovery, but just for even quality of life. And so I encourage you, to be patient with the process, because, those of us that have struggled with addiction, we didn't get here overnight, and, we're not going to heal overnight either. And, self-connection is grounded in self-love. And I really want to explain what I mean by that, because I think we can really misunderstand what self-love means, especially when our version of self-love has really been an unhealthy type of relating to ourselves and not really love at all. And so the old kind of self-love, you know, um, Katie Katahakis talks about narcissistic traits appear as particularly common features of sex addicts. Self-centered choices create unmanageability in the addict's or narcissist's life. And so, that's not really what we're talking about here. That's the old kind of self-love. That's a very self-centered and, not caring about anyone else, and really um, isn't really love. Really that type of love. Love, I'll put in quotation marks, is self-indulgent and self-neglecting and self-destructive. So, certainly when we're in our addiction, we're doing our best in some ways, like we're coping with our life and our emotions in the ways that we know how to cope with them. So it's not to place a judgment on that, but it's also, um, you know, it's so self-focused, but in a very destructive way, and really in a way that disowns things in our lives that are important to us, and people that are important to us, and I'd say it also disowns ourselves, um, even though it is very self-focused, but just in an unhealthy way. And so a new kind of self-love that can be part of our recovery and the way that we learn to relate to ourself. I found a great quote that goes with that. This kind of compulsive concern with I, me, and mine isn't the same as loving ourselves. Loving ourselves points us to capacities of resilience, compassion, and understanding within that are simply part of being alive. So again, this is not just all about me, but this is really learning to relate to myself in a different way, relate to my pain in a different way. And I think what you'll find as we explore this a little bit deeper is that this type of self-love is really something that does connect us more with others, with ourself. It isn't a selfish type of love. And really this is learning to give ourselves attention and care that we need. A lot of us, that's very difficult. A lot of us don't know how to do that. And so it's very important as we focus on our recovery to make this a high priority. And I really do see recovery in general as the way that I frame it is that it's reparenting ourselves. So again, it's learning to be the parent for ourselves that we need, and that's not just a parent that gives us everything that we want in the moment. That may be a parent that provides structure for us, but also provides nurturing and compassion and love and kindness. And so I've really seen that as part of my own recovery. And I think that that's a great way to look at this, is that I am learning to parent myself in the way that I need. And, I think this is also super important to, as we're focused on self-love and self-connection, that this is only a piece of the puzzle. Certainly, healing requires self-love, but it also requires love from others. Certainly we're going to learn how to care for ourselves, but we also need to learn how to connect with other people as well. And so, today we'll be focused on self-connection, but I do want everyone to, be aware that this is just a piece of recovery, but also a very foundational piece of recovery. So Catahawkis has a great webinar on loneliness, and I would really highly recommend that. It pairs really well with the topic today. And she said that part of recovery is making what Patrick Carnes calls a covenant with the self and coming to your own rescue. If you don't come to your own rescue as an adult, nobody will. And, I find that pretty profound because, certainly maybe we could see our higher power coming to our rescue, but really this is us taking responsibility for our own recovery. This is us kind of, doing what we need to do to save or to start our recovery moving in the right direction. And it was just about a year ago myself. I was in therapy and realized through my interaction with my therapist that I had been abandoned in different ways from my dad. He was alcoholic, bipolar, narcissistic, very self-focused, and I had been abandoned in many ways by him. And what I realized through therapy is that I had also abandoned myself. And that really hit me hard, especially as I started to go deeper and start to converse with myself and just realize that that I had, in many ways, been looking out there for other people to give me attention. And it was as if that was like an insatiable drive, and I was not giving myself the attention that I really needed. And so I did make kind of a covenant with myself, saying, I'm not going to abandon you anymore. I'm going to get to know you. I'm going to take care of you. And so I can really resonate with this idea of a covenant with the self. It's like, no, I am going to fight for you. And I see that as being part of our recovery. Flores says that until addicts develop the capacity to use their feelings as signals and to become emotionally intimate with themselves, they will continue to engage in their self-destructive and self-defeating behavior. So again, this is necessary. Self-connection is necessary. We become emotionally intimate with ourselves through this process, and it's very life-giving. It's very difficult. We'll need help along the way, but it is necessary in order for us to get the fullness of the healing that we need for our recovery. And so what is self-connection? I focus a lot on self-connection and life after lust. People may or may not realize that, but I think over half the book is related to self-connection in some way. And so there's lots of ways that can play out. And so these are some ways that I define self-connection when I talk about it. So it's learning to connect with our emotions and our needs, connecting with and caring for our body, connecting with our values and commitments, connecting with our future self, which I'll explain a little bit later, connecting with our sexuality in a healthy way, learning to love and accept ourselves. And I've found value in researching inner bonding is one type of theory around this type of, that talks more about connecting with self. And then internal family systems is another that I've found really valuable. I recommend if you want to do more of this connecting with the different parts of you, that those may be some things to check out. And there's lots of other therapeutic modalities and tools out there. Just wanted to point those out as being helpful for me. And so again, inner connection does impact outer connection. I think this is really important. I think especially because, when we come into recovery, in the very beginning, I find that most people they're not really doing it because they love themselves so much that they just want to pursue recovery. Usually people come in because they've destroyed something that they care about, a relationship, or they've experienced the consequences that are pretty severe, in a job or another setting. And so I think people aren't generally, in the beginning, really thinking, I'm just here for myself, just because I want to be healed and I want to be whole, although that could definitely be part of it. But I think I mentioned that because it is helpful, I think, especially in the beginning, to realize that self-connection will affect those other relationships. It will affect your relationship with your partner, and definitely your relationship with your kids and with other people. And so I think, especially in the beginning, that's really helpful for us to realize that it's not just for our benefit, but it benefits our relationships as well. And so self-connections leads to other connection. Flores, again, says that the larger lesson the addict has to learn is that emotions are not only vital to self-understanding, but also crucial to the understanding of others' feelings and the negotiation of all forms of intimacy in interpersonal relationships. So again, that's so important to realize, is that, yeah, we want to understand emotions for our own benefit, but if we're going to start understanding other people's emotions, we're really going to have to start here, and it can have an impact on all those other relationships. And so really, as I connect with myself, I am more emotionally present and can learn to connect with others. As I learn to value myself, I learn to value others and seek to heal my relationship with my higher power, my partner, my children, my friends, my community, and my world. All right, so now we get into a little bit more practical, like part of the talk, and just turn to talk about recovery, connection, self-connection skills and tools. And just a little disclaimers here. Some of these tools, maybe you may be in a place where you can self-direct, you can practice these at home, you can add these into your life, but you also may be in a very vulnerable or unstable place, and you may need to practice some of these exercises with the help or guidance of a therapist. And maybe you may need to do both. When we're talking about connecting with our emotions, sometimes we do have things going on within us that we can't. We need the help of others, and so just want to throw that out there. I think that's super important, to just use some discretion as you think about these tools and how you might be able to apply them. And then this, I think, is so important too, that we have a posture of self-love as we're learning skills and as we're learning new tools. That we basically, it's not just using the tools that helps us, but it's how we use the tools. It's how we relate to ourselves while we use the tools, that we use the tools in a compassionate way. I think I've done this in my recovery, where I've, learned all these tools and then put this really hard burden on myself, this really heavy load on myself, where I'm like, I have to do all these at once. And so, yeah, I may be practicing good things, but I'm also overloading myself and doing it in a very strict and just an unkind type of way. So I hope that you would take that into consideration. And so many people in recovery have seen this, the cycle of addiction. And, the way that I explain it is that, there's some type of pain or shame or something going on within us that that is stirring up. And, when we're caught in the cycle of addiction, we're active in our addiction, what's natural for us is to reach in, which which is basically disconnecting from ourselves, from others. We don't want to feel that. So we disconnect from it. We disconnect from our pain, and we go into preoccupation and fantasy and, into the rituals and acting out. And then we end up with more pain because of the pain that we ignored in the first place, on top of the pain from acting out in the way that we chose to. And so it really is connected. So really this cycle of addiction is also a cycle of disconnection from self. So I think that that's a really helpful way to look at this, that this isn't just about the addiction, but it's also part of the problem, and part of what keeps us in this place is we're actively disconnecting from ourself, from our pain. And so, think about all the ways that you avoid pain and shame. I can think of many that are common and that I do at times. And so certainly addiction, whether it's sexual addiction or substance abuse, that could be a way of avoiding pain, numbing pain, escaping pain. Workaholism, I think it's very easy to get so busy working that we don't pay attention to ourselves. There may be stuff going on, under the surface that we just are not paying attention to because we're so busy. And, I think a lot of us can, even in recovery, we could think, oh yeah, I'm healing, I'm abstaining. But as you'll see, really with all of these things, is just because you're not acting out sexually, if you're picking some other way to avoid your pain and shame, it's really not recovery. You're really just finding another distraction. And so, we could do that with food. I mean, comfort food is a big one. I think many of us do that, and it is comforting in a sense. Denial, we may avoid the reality, avoid looking at the reality that that there really is something going on. This comes up for me because, I've mentioned that I've had a lot of childhood traumas, and, every now and then I'll just be overwhelmed and just realize, oh man, it'll kind of like overwhelm me thinking, oh man, I'm a therapist. I should be over this by now. Or, I just get re-triggered and think it's kind of overwhelming. Like, oh no, maybe I'm more broken than I thought I was. It's that feeling of overwhelming shame and a feeling of brokenness. And I think, at times I could just go through life denying that pain is there, because it's a difficult feeling to deal with. But it's also not helpful to just deny it, as we'll talk about here as we go along. Distractions. So, there's a million distractions: Facebook, Netflix. You name it. We all know what can distract us from the pain inside of us. Perfectionism. Again, I can really relate to this one. Part of me thinks if I can just do everything perfect, then I won't have to feel pain. I won't have to feel shame. I won't have to look in the mirror and say, oh yeah, I really made a mistake. A lot of this has to do with how I relate to myself as well. And so I think perfectionism is another way to avoid feeling. But it actually, none of these really work long term. They all are unhealthy ways of coping. And they really, again, what they do is they're all ways of disowning our pain, disowning ourselves. And so they're really not helpful. And so in recovery, we learn to pay attention to our pain. And so in Life After Lust, I wrote it this way. Remember how the addiction cycle begins with pain? In recovery, we stop addictively reacting to our pain and begin lovingly responding to it. The pained part in us doesn't need some lust-filled distraction. It needs care and compassion. In recovery, we learn to become our own loving parent, so to speak. the presence of our evil genius reminds us to pay attention rather than neglecting the cries of our heart. And, just to explain what the evil genius is briefly, it's like, it's a characterization of the addiction, or that voice in our heads that says, basically, if we're not going to take care of our needs, we're not going to take care of our pain, it's that voice that says, let me take care of that. I have some great ideas of how you can get rid of that pain. So that's the evil genius. And obviously, that's not a helpful voice. It may have helped us survive our life in different scenarios, but in recovery, it's not a helpful voice. And really, what I'm saying here is that when that voice starts speaking to us, it's a reminder. It's like the light on the dashboard going off, saying, hey, something under the hood needs attention. So when our evil genius shows up, we can just thank it and say, oh, thank you for alerting me that there's something that needs my attention. And so that's what we're talking about here. And I think that's a really helpful way to look at it. Now, I do want to talk a little bit here about self-criticism, because I think a lot of us think that if we're self-critical enough and we really just, whip ourselves into shape and, even punish ourselves, that will motivate us. And, if you get anything from this talk, I'd say this would be a big take home, is that if you're relating to yourself in a self-critical way and thinking that you're going to achieve long-term recovery, that is really an ineffective strategy. It's very self-defeating. And, there's science to back that up. And I think that's super helpful for us to be aware of. Again, we need to change our relationship with ourself. That self-critical voice and way of relating with ourselves, it actually puts our body into fight or flight. It's a self-attack. It triggers adrenaline and cortisol. It puts us into stress. So it would make sense that when we're putting ourselves into a stressful state, that eventually we're going to want to act out or feel better. So we really have to change our relationship with ourselves, because the self-critical way of relating to ourselves is really going to put us into a pre-trigger state, or a state, I call it prelapse, like we're vulnerable, we're on our way to relapse, but we're not quite there yet. And the self-critical voice, and way of relating to ourselves, it inhibits change. It won't help us change. And if you're interested in some of the science behind that, I highly recommend Kelly McGonigal's talk on the willpower instinct when she talked to Google. That's on YouTube, and I've actually taken a lot of her material and modified it and adapted it to sexual addiction treatment. And I mean, there'll be pieces of it throughout this talk. But if you're interested in learning some of the science behind this, that's a helpful place to check out. And this is so true. Really, we can't hate ourselves into a version of ourselves that we can love. So again, self-hate isn't the way. It's not going to, if I hate myself and hurt myself and neglect myself, but I'm sober, that's really not going to lead us to the path of healing that we need. And that really will not result in any positive change. At least below the surface, we can really, white knuckle it and really say, I'm committed to this. But if we're not doing this deeper work, we really are not going to heal. It's not going to be very fun either. And so self-compassion is a powerful science-backed alternative to self-criticism. And so I want to spend a little bit of time explaining what self-compassion is, a little bit of how it works and why it's so effective, because it's a powerful tool. It's a powerful skill. And in Life After Lust, I talk about how actually place self-compassion as a skill to master in recovery. So mastering the art of self-compassion is a key component of successful recovery. So I hope that you'll take this tool and it'll change your life. It really is a powerful way to learn to relate to ourselves that does give us the best shot of actually changing and healing. So what is self-compassion? Kristen Neff, who has a book called Self-Compassion, she says that it's not a way of judging ourselves positively. Self-compassion is a way of relating to ourselves kindly, embracing ourselves as we are, flaws and all. So again, it's not about self-esteem. It's not about, thinking we're amazing people, which, we can definitely do that. But it's really about how we relate to ourselves, how we do we have a kind attitude towards ourselves. And Kelly McGonigal says, it's being kind and supportive to yourself whenever you're experiencing suffering. So again, this isn't about accepting behavior that's self-destructive or harmful, but this is about learning to respond to ourselves when we're going through a difficult time. And if you're interested, selfcompassion.org has lots of resources related to self-compassion. You can actually test yourself to see how self-compassionate you are. If you're interested, go ahead and check that out. So a little bit more about self-compassion. I do want to sell you on self-compassion. I think it's so effective, and I think some of this information will help you understand why it is so powerful. So there's over 100 journal articles on self-compassion, and it's actually kind of boring research because it all points to this being self-compassion being predictive of psychological well-being. So it's pretty conclusive evidence for that. Beverly Engel talks about shame, compassion being the antidote to shame. So it is a powerful way of relating to ourselves when we're feeling shame, and I've found that to be incredibly effective. Also, self-compassion decreases our tendency to internalize failure. So, I mean, that's huge. I think, a lot of us have a shame-based identity that are addicts or that have been through. Some of us have that shame-based identity even from our childhoods. And, it's important that when we make a mistake, we don't internalize it. We don't think, oh, I'm bad, but it helps, we understand that it's our behavior. It's not us that's bad. Our behavior may be unhelpful, but it's not our identity of being a bad person. Self-compassion therapies, including compassion-focused therapy, have demonstrated that compassionate mind states may be learned and may alleviate shame, as well as other distressing outcomes, such as depression, anxiety, self-attacks, feelings of inferiority, and submissive behavior. It also is helpful for affect regulation. It's basically it's learning to have an attuned responsiveness towards ourself. It's interesting. I use this all the time, and I was even practicing self-compassion right before this talk, just to help calm me and help me know that I'm here for me, and it's very effective. So it can help us when we're feeling anxious or just overwhelmed. And it's pretty awesome how this works is, there is actually a chemical reaction in the body that self-compassion, especially, I'll explain a little bit more about this later, but part of self-compassion is actually like putting, one way to practice self-compassion is, putting your hands over your heart, as well as other pieces to it. which I'll explain in a minute, but it actually produces oxytocin and it decreases cortisol. So it's really amazing how this works. You know, it actually has a chemical effect on our bodies, and we can feel soothed and safe, and you know, feel like, okay, I can move forward. You know, it's pretty powerful. And also, a part of self-compassion is mindfulness, and you know that can decrease suffering as well. You know, we're less reactive to our life and to the things we're struggling with, because we're being mindful of it instead of reacting to it. It can also decrease PTSD symptoms, practicing self-compassion. And so Brene Brown talks about, in her book Daring Greatly, she says, self-compassion is key because when we're able to be gentle with ourselves in the midst of shame, we're more likely to reach out, connect, and experience empathy. And so again, that's bringing this back to, you know, self-compassion really helps us, but it also helps us connect with other people. And, you know, I want to mention too, you know, I just going back there where it talks about decreases PTSD symptoms. You know, self-compassion is a powerful tool that I've used with the partners that I've worked with, you know, to help them through their betrayal trauma. And so just want to point that out, that this is a tool for all of us, not just people in recovery from an addiction. It's something that we can all utilize and implement into our life. Self-compassion also increases our ability to return to commitments and goals after setbacks, slips, or relapses. So that's super important. Like if you want to learn how to, I mean, none of us are going to do recovery perfectly. And if you want to learn how to get back on track fast, learn to master self-compassion. Self-criticism leads to further setbacks, slips, and quitting. You know, if you think about somebody that relapses and then goes into a binge, you know, or, you know, say they, you know, they relapse and, you know, they're off the map, you know, for weeks. You know, I think part of that could be related to how they responded to themselves the moment they had that first slip. And so I think this is super important. A great way to kind of to turn around and to learn to get back up really fast. And it's very effective. So again, when we feel safe and comforted, we're in the optimal mind state to do our best. So if you know, compare that to the mind state that we get into in a self-critical place, it's like the opposite. So, you know, it's kind of like, you know, a child that, you know, when they feel connected to their parent, it's like they can take risks, they can go exploring. You know, they're much more likely to be able to be confident and know that if they make a mistake or if they're in pain, they can go back, you know, they can go and reconnect. And so, you know, when we feel safe and comforted, it really does allow us to do more, and is much more helpful. So from the book, some of the most profound moments in life will be those times when you stop, see your pain, feel the surfacing emotions, and respond with care, compassion, and nurturance. This is tending to your wounds. This is attuning to the cries of your heart. And so that's what this is about, is really learning to attune to our pain and doing it in a very compassionate way that does lead to soothing and does help us. So now we're going to talk about some specific tools. These ones right here, there's a couple here that are focused specifically on self-compassion. And so, you know, this video is recorded and will be up up on YouTube, on the CHS channel. And so you can go back and look at this if you're interested in actually practicing this. So the first recovery skills that this is going to focus on is self-compassion and managing emotional pain. So the tool is called the letter of self-compassion. And so I'm going to explain to you what that means and how you can apply it. So this, and I got this from Kelly McGonigal, has an excellent audio series called The Neuroscience of Change. And it's super powerful. And I got this from that, and there's many other tools in that series, so I highly recommend it. So this is to be used when experiencing difficult emotions or challenging situations. And this is pretty cool. You know, in a study where participants wrote this self-compassion letter to themselves once a day for 1 week, taking 10 to 15 minutes per day, their happiness increased and their depression decreased during that week, continuing through a follow-up 6 months later. This powerful exercise trains you to speak to yourself in a self-compassionate way, experiencing the many benefits of relating to yourself in this way. It is recommended that this letter writing exercise be used every day for 7 days. After that, it can be used once a week, once a month, or whenever experiences of stress or suffering arise. And so, you know, it's interesting. I had one client take this tool, and he's told me that he's done probably around 60 self-compassion letters, and it's made a profound difference for him. And so I love it when somebody takes a tool and they really practice it and they learn to master it. You know, I'll mention also, actually, I'll continue on. I'll explain how I apply this and how it can be used in a couple minutes. So basically, the way you write this letter of self-compassion is you pick something stressful or difficult that you've experienced today. I think it's just incredibly effective if you can do it in the moment of suffering. You know, when you're really feeling the emotion, it can be very powerful in that moment. So basically, writing in the second person, you begin by describing to yourself what you're feeling and thinking about whatever happened. You don't get into the details of the event. You just focus on your internal experience. So, for example, you know, dear Forrest, I can see you're feeling really sad right now. I can see you're regretting your decision to whatever and beating yourself up about it. And I can tell you're really disappointed about whatever. And basically, the more emotions that you can point out, that you can identify and you can define that you're feeling, the better. And, you know, those of us, you know, I'd say most addicts really do have a hard time doing that, picking out their emotions. You know, you may have heard of alexithymia, where they really don't have an understanding of what they're feeling. They don't have words for it. They might have sensations, but they don't have a way of pinning it down and communicating that. And so, but the more feelings you can actually name, you may have heard name it to tame it. You know, you name these specific emotions, and it can really help you be mindful. And again, that's another way of attuning to ourselves. You know, it's like a parent saying, "Oh, I see you're feeling sad," or it looks like you're feeling very disappointed. You know, it's a moment of connection. And so the second piece, so mindfulness is the first piece of self-compassion. The second piece of self-compassion is common humanity. And so in this place, you write yourself a common humanity message. So basically, you remind yourself about how your experience, your feelings, your thoughts, whatever occurred, connects you to everyone else. you remind yourself that what you're going through is part of being human and something everyone experiences at times. And that's not to justify your choices. It's not to say like, don't worry that you relapsed, everybody does it. That is not what we're talking about here at all. It's not to justify what you've done, especially if it's self-destructive, but it's really to say that, what you're going through does not make you uniquely broken. You're okay. This type of suffering is part of what makes you human, and that can really decrease the shame. That sense that we're uniquely broken and we're really messed up, and what kind of a person would do that? So I think it can be very powerful in that sense of common humanity. What I'm experiencing is part of what makes me human. And again, to decrease feelings of feeling uniquely flawed is part of that. And then the third part is writing yourself a self-guidance and self-kindness message. So what may help is you can think, what would you say to someone else that you love that's going through the same experience? That may be easier to formulate the words if you can think, oh, what would I say to someone else that's suffering? Because we do have a hard time thinking about what we'll say to ourselves. So you can think, what encouragement, guidance, and loving support would you offer them? You could also imagine your future self, years in the future, writing to you, offering the support of wisdom and guidance. You might write about the gratitude you have that your present self is experiencing this right now. Some advice about what helped you learn from the experience, and how to refocus on your goals. And basically, you write to yourself, what do you need to hear to feel supported, encouraged, and understood? So you're learning to kind of coach yourself and be kind to yourself, and you're offering advice, but it's after caring about the emotion. And I think that's a big deal. I have memories of reaching out to accountability partners, and before they responded to the distress that I was experiencing, they just give me advice, or they give me a quote or a Bible verse, or thinking that will connect me or help me in some way. And for me, I have a reaction to that, like, no, I need you to pay attention to the pain first before you're gonna give me advice. And so that's kind of what we're doing in this scenario. When we're writing this letter, we're paying attention to the pain first, and then we're offering ourselves some advice. And so when you finish, you read the letter aloud to yourself, or you have someone you read, or you have someone you trust read it to you. And you can save these letters for times when you need encouragement. And what I've done with clients, and this is very powerful, is I'll have them write the letter, and then it's a whole different experience when you have somebody else read it to you. So like in groups, have everybody pair up into dyads and have them have the other person read their letter to them. It's super powerful, hearing it in a real voice, and it can really touch deep. It can really help a person feel very supported, and again, it's a way to respond to our suffering, and is very helpful and very effective. So the next recovery skills that we'll focus on are managing shame, minimizing self-criticism and self-forgiveness, and also rising quickly from perceived failures. So these are definitely skills that we need in recovery. I could see there's questions, and I will definitely get to those. So this is a little bit from the book, just introducing this piece here. So in recovery, change is a process that never unfolds perfectly. As we learn the recovery lifestyle, it is essential to also learn how to respond if sobriety is compromised. Depending on the degree of our acting out behavior, this experience is referred to as a slip or a relapse. No matter how it is defined, a person's response to this kind of setback reveals the strength of their recovery process. Shame is a normal feeling in moments of perceived failure. Self-criticism can naturally result from feelings of shame, yet a self-critical mindset decreases one's ability to successfully change and increases the chances of repeating the behavior and giving up. Also, those who are most self-critical have less self-control and motivation. Thus, it is unlikely that true change will occur when self-criticism remains the default manner of relating with oneself, especially in times of failure and weakness. On the other hand, a self-compassionate response increases one's ability to get back on track quickly. For those of us struggling with a shame-based identity, a perceived failure can quickly result in the desire to quit. Of course, quitting will not lead to lasting change, but strengthening the skill of responding self-compassionately to setbacks will powerfully propel us towards successful recovery. Here's an example of how a person in recovery could self-compassionately respond to a slip or relapse that supports connecting with self and with others. So basically, I know I've explained that a couple of times, that we need to, respond to perceived failures with self-compassion, and so, but we also need to learn from those failures, especially when we're in recovery, right? We want to be self-compassionate, but we also want to learn from the experience and figure out, what do I need to do differently next time, especially if the results are very destructive, towards ourselves or towards others. And so this is a tool that I've created. It's in the book. Obviously, it'll be available on the video if you want to refer back to that. But I call it the failure response worksheet. And so the way that you use this is basically you start using a journal. You answer the following. This would be after you failed in some way, and this is talking about specifically how to respond when you've slipped or relapsed. So you write what triggered me to want to act out. So you're starting to understand what was going on for me when I did that, or started wanting to do that. You write down what am I saying to myself about my behavior. So words of self-criticism, shame, self-compassion. And then you practice a self-compassion break. And this is a powerful tool. I mean, really one of the most powerful tools that I've found, especially it's a quick tool. It's something you can do very simply, but I'll explain that tool and just know that that's a part of this tool, or the self-compassion break is part of the failure response worksheet, but it's also a tool you can use anytime you're suffering or going through a hard time. You can just stop and do the self-compassion break. And so what you do for the self-compassion break is you close your eyes, you name all the feelings that you feel right now. Example, guilt, shame, anger, sadness, disappointment, fear. And so again, it's that mindfulness piece. And you say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. And then comes the common humanity piece. And so again, this is not meant to justify the choice, but to normalize the feelings that result and to decrease shame, which is unproductive. And so you can say to yourself the following phrases. Suffering is a part of life. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes when they're trying to make big changes. My imperfections don't mean that something is wrong with me, but only that I am human. there are many people who feel this right now as a result of their choices. And then again, this is so important, to put your hands over your heart, feel the warmth of your hands and feel yourself breathing. Or you can use another gesture that is soothing physical touch that is non-sexual. And this gesture combined with kind words, as I mentioned before, produces oxytocin, deepening a feeling of connection and comfort. And really, I think for many, this will initially feel awkward. And certainly don't do this if, this is triggering in some way or you're not ready for this. But even if it does feel a little awkward and you do feel ready for this, that I encourage you to try it. I've had many clients do this, and yeah, it feels awkward in the beginning. They're used to touching themselves sexually or in relation to the addiction, but when it comes to doing it in a soothing way, it's really foreign. But I really encourage you to try that if you're able to. And then you also do a self-kindness message. So you could say to yourself the following phrases: may I be kind to myself, may I give myself the compassion that I need, may I forgive myself, may I be patient with myself, may I be strong, may I keep moving forward in my recovery. So for some people, and probably for many people, that is a very different way of relating to yourself when you've made a mistake or you've failed. And, some people would say, well, you just need to feel the pain. You just need to feel about how bad this impacted everybody else. And, it's really not the way. Certainly we need to realize how our choices have affected others, but that's really not what we're needing in that moment of pain. And so this is a really powerful way to respond to yourself. And then after you do the self-compassion break, you get your journal out again and you answer the following: what tools can I use next time that I'm in a similar situation? How can I limit access to this form of acting out in the future? Like, how can I, what boundaries do I need to set up so that this is not so easy to do next time? And then you reach out to someone and tell them about your slip or relapse as soon as possible. So again, you've connected with yourself, and now you're connecting with your support network. Reconnect with your higher power and another human being. This decreases shame and secrecy, disempowering the addiction. Depending on the degree of damage to others, restitution and amends may be warranted. Sadly, we can never predict what pain or consequences will result from our choices. This is the risk of relapse. What we can control is our present response. And then repeatedly using this failure response worksheet will train us to become our own supportive coach rather than a demoralizing critic. This can provide motivation to get up quickly and move forward, increasing the possibility of significant long-term changes. And so, I really hope that you would use this tool. I think using this tool repeatedly can make a big difference in the long term, and really probably help many people achieve sobriety and success in a way that they hadn't previously achieved it. And you can use this for other failures as well. But again, responding with that self-compassion will really give you the best chance of getting back on track fast. And so just an encouragement, if you've fallen, be brave. Remember that a setback only paves the way for a comeback. Get up quickly, practice self-compassion, examine your blind spots, reconnect with others, forgive yourself, finish your race, and finish strong. So I really hope that you'll use this tool as a way of finishing strong. Like, this is one of those tools that can help you achieve long-term recovery. And again, it comes back to self-connection. as a powerful tool. So I mentioned briefly future self-connection, and this is interesting. I hadn't heard about this until just a few years ago. But Dr. Kelly McGonigal, she talks about future self-connection in detail, sharing that according to research, feeling separate from one's future self decreases one's protection of that future self's well-being. Conversely, feeling connected to one's future self increases self-control. So I think that's pretty awesome. Like that's, if we can realize and really have a deep experience of knowing and feeling that, who we are in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, that's really us, and there's some cool studies around this, of related to people saving for their retirement, that you can look into that, this future self-connection really does affect choices that we'll make now that do affect us into the future, long term. And so I won't get into it and explain it in too much detail now, but I do want you to know these resources are in the book. Kelly McGonigal, again, in her talk to Google, she explains these resources. She explains the letter from your future self. Basically it's a letter saying, thank you for taking your recovery seriously. These are the ways that it impacted me and my relationships. This is the ripple effect of you being in recovery. And thank you for doing that. And these are the things that you did that helped you be successful. And just a very encouraging and supportive letter, that can increase your sense of connection with that person that is you in the future. And the more we feel that connection, which can be strengthened through these exercises, the more we can feel like, okay, I really do want to make a decisions now that will, pave the way for creating that future. And there's also a visualization that's powerful, where you visualize that positive future in recovery, connected to yourself and others and your higher power. And then you also imagine kind of do a more negative imagining that can also be motivating too, that you imagine, where things could be if you don't do recovery. And, I wouldn't recommend that if you're, deeply depressed, or if that's going to, trigger some other things for you. But it can be very motivating also. So those are some things for you to be aware of. Again, it's future self-connection, but it is a form of self-connection. And then another tool I use in my program and just have found very helpful is called the Journaling Awareness Worksheet. This is a free resource. If you go to howwelove.com/resources, it's basically a worksheet that helps you, journal through, what you're going through, the suffering that you're experiencing. And it can even help connect it to the past, to pain in the past. It basically, I only showed 3 here, but there's like 10 different steps that you can do. And so I just wanted to show it as an example that this is another way to really use writing to connect with yourself, and especially, understand yourself and respond to yourself when you're going through suffering. And there's lots of other journaling exercises you can do. I have my journal right here, and I've, at times I've, written to my inner child, and then use my left hand to write back from my inner child, and just had a dialogue. I've experimented with different things like that and found it helpful. So there's lots of tools out there, and these are just a few, but I hope that you'll really see this idea of self-connection as necessary, and that you would pick some tools that work for you. And so just to talk a little bit about, what are the ripple effects of this interconnection? And this is a quote from Running on Empty No More. And Janice Webb, she says, beginning to feel your emotions is no small thing. In fact, it's deceptively tremendous. As you chip away the wall that your child's self built to block out your emotions, you begin to feel more and more valid and more alive. If you start out feeling little to nothing, you can find yourself a bit disconcerted by these new experiences. Bit by bit, you find yourself feeling the weight of sadness in your chest, the zing of excitement in your belly, or perhaps some anger or hurt from past wrongs that were done you. Some of these emotions can be painful, yes. Others are joyous and loving. All of them, positive and negative, connect you to your true self, to the world, and to the people around you in a new way that you never imagined. Everyone is different, of course, but one factor is shared by all who are on the path of childhood emotional neglect recovery. All are changing their lives by changing themselves on the inside. And changing on the inside has ripple effects on the outside. Every positive, healthy change that you make in yourself affects the people around you. And so I just think that's so hopeful, that, as we do this deeper work, as we learn to respond to ourselves, as we, go to therapy even and learn to connect with ourselves, that it has a ripple effect. It affects us for sure, but then it also spreads out and affects others. So self-care. So this is definitely an important piece of recovery. And so I just want to share a little bit about how self-care is, again, another form of self-connection, and is how it has really profound effects on recovery. So in recovery myself, I know all too well that when we don't invest time in self-care, we will waste time in addiction. Maybe you've experienced that. And self-care, I think it's important kind of why we're doing self-care. I think a lot of us do self-care, like caring for our bodies, out of self-hate, like we have to change our bodies. We don't like our bodies, but I think it can be amazing to actually learn to do it out of self-love. I actually want to care for my body. And I encourage you to strengthen your recovery routines through self-care that increases self-control. And there's different types of self-care that actually increases self-control in our brains, neurologically. And sorry, my screen is covering my quote, so I can't read it. So the way that I bring this together and is just again another quote from the book. Sexual addiction impairs the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and one of the necessary functions of the prefrontal cortex is providing self-control. According to neurosurgeon Dr. Donald Hilton, impairment of the prefrontal cortex leads to many problems, including impulsivity, compulsivity, and impaired judgment. The more a person acts out sexually, the less self-control they will have to stop themselves from acting on future impulses. This is a vicious cycle. It explains why both abstinence and the practice of brain strengthening activities are an essential part of the recovery process. And so what are some of those pieces of self-care that actually strengthen self-control neurologically? And what those are, and just so you're aware that if you're interested in more of the science behind this, again, check out Kelly McGonigal's talk on YouTube. And I've also explained a lot of it in a chapter in the book called The Neuroscience of Self-Care that goes into a lot more details. But I'll explain the gist of it now so you understand. So mindfulness is one of those activities that really strengthens the self-control part of the brain. I just read an article recently that, even actually different types of mindfulness affect different parts of the brain. But this is one thing that can be especially helpful, even if it's just a mindful breathing exercise. And so there's different exercises you can do with that where you focus on your breathing. Even if you just start with like 5 minutes a day, it can help you. Nutrition is a big one. It's been shown that when we have huge spikes in blood sugar and then we experience the crash afterwards, that it can actually affect our self-control. And so, make us feel more impulsive. And so that's something to be aware of. And also, I think many of us, definitely myself included, misuse nutrition. Definitely there can be an addiction to sugar, a crossing over of addictions. And so nutrition definitely affects us. It affects our brain, but it also affects our moods. And so it's just something to be aware of in recovery, that this is something that we need to pay attention to. And as a way of strengthening self-control, but also learning to love ourselves. Sleep is a huge one. For me, this is like a game changer. Like if I don't get enough sleep, that's when my evil genius starts speaking to me as well. And, I remember when I was, before I took my recovery, before I got to a place where I could really achieve long-term sobriety, I had an overnight shift at a group home. And, so I was awake from like 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. the next morning. And I was, active in my addiction, and I wasn't realizing how severely that was impacting me. That sleep deprivation was really impairing my self-control. And so, some of us, I know sleep is difficult if you have little children at home. There's other ways that, there are ways that we can take this seriously. And so, but what I really want you to know is that sleep does affect our self-control, and maybe you've experienced that. So that is a piece of self-care that we really cannot neglect. Exercise, again, that strengthens self-control. I won't really tell you, I won't tell you, how to exercise or how often or anything like that, but just know that it does affect and strengthen self-control. And certainly sobriety, it makes sense that we would, stop doing the thing that's lessening our self-control. So that may be a no-brainer, but obviously that's going to make a difference on our self-control, and to, really is a way of continuing to care for ourselves by not being active in the addiction. Catahawkis says that by stressing health first, if you're a therapist working with the client, the therapist supports the development of self-love and the recognition that, to some extent, recovering persons must reparent themselves as a step towards coming to their own assistance. So again, this, learning how to just take care of our body and take care of our health, like that, again, is another form of self-love and even reparenting ourselves. And, a quote from the book, recovery is all about course correction, not perfection. So again, when we think about all these things that may help us to change, I'd encourage you to, it's just a reminder that we don't have to be perfect at this. We can learn to course correct, and we can just grow. And that's important. Catahawkis also says that mindful behavior boosts relapse prevention for all recovering addicts, and on a broader level, savoring the body's nourishment and experiencing its present moments provide practice being in a body and in loving it. Physical exercise is one of the most important aids to health and well-being. Physical activity shapes the structure and function of the prefrontal cortex and improves the performance in PFC-related cognitive tasks, over time and increases right frontal lobe volume. So again, just mindfulness and exercise really are effective in how they impact the brain. I'm going to kind of speed up here because I do want to get to everybody's questions. Just want to mention that fun and relaxation are another way of connecting with ourselves. You know, addicts demonstrate an almost complete inability to relax and enjoy themselves. So again, learning to play and relax in healthy ways, I think I want to just frame it that those are ways of connecting with ourselves, and those are part of recovery, that we need to learn how to experience pleasure in a way that that is outside of the addiction. Also, that boundaries are a form of self-love. You know, as we learn to value ourselves, we protect ourselves. We protect our body, our mind, our heart. If we value ourselves, we are careful who we're around socially. We care for our spirituality, if that's an important part of our lives, as an act of self-love, and balance time and priorities accordingly as well. And you know, just I love this picture here, because this, you know, success in recovery, I think it's actually deep. It needs to be a deep recovery. And so the tools that we're talking about today, these skills of connecting with yourself, are really meant to help you have a deep recovery. And so it may not be obvious that you're recovering, but if you practice these things, it will really aid in a long-term recovery. So I hope that you'll keep that in mind. And also, just, you know, as we think about these different tools, you know, I share this in the book, and I believe this, that practice leads to mastery. You know, so how do we practice these things? Well, we definitely can practice daily self-connection as a habit, but also use it in times of suffering. So we can practice it, you know, practice self-compassion every day, but then also especially use it in those times that are difficult for us. I also have a 52-week plan that allows people to kind of guides people through this process if you're feeling overwhelmed, like there's so much to do, that could be helpful. And I also have the Life After Lust programs, which is, you know, online as a therapeutic program here in California, and will eventually be a broader program that's more of a coaching focus that can help more people worldwide. Recommended reading: Life After Lust, Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, Kate Katahakis, Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation, Finding Peace by Troy Love. He has a retreat as well. Kelly McGonigal, Neuroscience of Change, Kristen Neff, Self-Compassion, Janice Webb, Running on Empty, and Running on Empty No More. And so just to finish our time, as we do just a little recap here, this really brings it together. Most addicts are masters of secrecy, self-criticism, and self-neglect, pain avoidance, and disconnection. In recovery, we gradually let go of these unhealthy, unhelpful practices and grab hold of life-giving ones. We don't just learn new methods of self-medication or distraction. In successful recovery, we become masters of honesty, self-compassion, self-care, pain management, and connection. In recovery, we master ourselves, our emotions, and our responses to our circumstances. And in conclusion, I mean, this is really the reason that I'm here, and really a wish for all of you that are recovering. I wish for you freedom from shame and self-imposed suffering, freedom from debilitating secret-driven fears, freedom from self-hatred and self-neglect, freedom from punishment and pain, freedom from the autopilot of addiction. I wish for you freedom to heal and to feel, freedom to lavishly love others, freedom to fight for yourself and the ones you cherish most, freedom to generously give back, freedom to champion worthy causes, freedom to live, lasting freedom. So I hope that these tools will help you experience that lasting freedom. And now I'll get to the questions. I can definitely see there's a lot of interaction there. So I will get out of this. And hey, there's actually people here. It's kind of strange doing a presentation for over an hour and being like, hey, there's people. So, all right, let me look at these questions here. So one question is, how do you connect with your sexuality in a healthy way when you've struggled with sex addiction for many years? Are there resources that help guide one toward a more healthy view of sex? And that's a great question. Yeah, I do talk about this in my book, that this is a big part of recovery, is, learning to experience sex, not as a drug, but learning to have a healthy relationship with sex. So, the Center for Healthy Sex, they have lots of webinars focused on this. I know Alexandra Katahakis has written a book on this, and I also recommend a book by the Burr Cause, and that's a book specific to sexual addicts. But yeah, I think this is super important. Not that we don't just neglect ourselves sexually, that we don't just go into a state of ignoring our sexuality, because that's not really living. It's not really healthy. But we do learn. Part of it is learning to connect with our emotions, learning to connect with our body, and learning to connect with our partner or whoever we are with sexually. Another piece to this is, I say that we should, not use our partner to act out, not use our partner to masturbate, or just, use them as an outlet, just as if we would use them as part of the addiction. But really it's focused on connection being the centerpiece of our sexuality. And so that's a little bit on that. I'd recommend those resources. What do you recommend to someone in recovery who is struggling to see or hear their feelings, emotions, or can't recall them in order to address them? Well, many of us are in this situation, especially in early recovery. I have my clients get out a feeling chart, and we start learning, what do these feelings actually mean? So we'll do that in our check-ins. I'll have people use the feeling charts and figure out what these, what the different emotions are. So that can be part of the process. I think you really do have to have kind of a humble outlook on this, because it's kind of like you're starting out like a little kid. You might feel like, man, I should know this by now. What's wrong with me? But really just be patient with yourself and understand that this is going to take some learning, and therapy can help with that as well. But yeah, those are some things. But that's a really good question, because I do not expect people to be good at this, especially in the beginning. It's something that takes a long time to master, and nobody's perfect at it. So thank you for asking that. So this is someone, as a clinician, I find that my clients' families or partners have a hard time accepting sex addiction or porn addiction as something that is real. They view it as an excuse. While my clients and I know how invalidating this is and how very real this addiction is, I struggle to help those on the outside understand them and work with them to heal. Any advice? Yeah, that's a great question. I really do think that, even those of us in recovery, we do need to be careful that we don't use sex addiction and porn addiction as an excuse. You know, and that might sound a little insensitive, but really, obviously, it's real. It's something that's affected us and our lives, but we also need to take responsibility. Like, it's not a reason to justify our behavior. We can't just say, "Well, I'm an addict, so I'm just going to go do this," you know. And I'm not implying that that's what you mean by this necessarily, but you know, if people don't accept it, I guess that's their deal. But you know, for us, we know that it's real, um, and I mean, the best we can do is take responsibility for it, and um, you know, take it seriously for our own recovery. So I don't know if that is a helpful enough answer, but I hope it is. Do you use any list of motivational statements that you say aloud each day or at stressful times? Are there any tips you have for writing such statements? Well, you know, this is interesting because I definitely, I mentioned some statements of self-encouragement, you know, acknowledging suffering, you know, you're going to get through this. It's okay. I'm here for you. But I didn't really focus on it from like an affirmation standpoint. And I'm not really certain about affirmations. The challenge with affirmations is that, you know, if we have a shame-based identity, I mean, we can look in the mirror and tell ourselves all day that we're amazing, we're great people, but we're not going to believe it. And so I'm sure there's a place for affirmations, but I think what's more effective than affirmations is really practicing that, being with ourselves emotionally and responding to ourselves emotionally, you know, learning to care for ourselves. So hopefully that's helpful. Oh yes, somebody mentioned The Couple's Guide to Intimacy. Thank you. That escaped me. So yeah, that's a really great book, and it's written specifically for people in sex addiction recovery. Is a great book. All right, I think I answered everybody's questions that was typed to me. I'll look over here and see if I missed any other questions. Okay, yeah, the woman that I mentioned several times, looks like other people responded as well. So there's a talk where Kelly McGonigal talks to Google, and it's like an hour long, and it is like literally packed with resources. Some of the things I've mentioned today, she goes into the science of self-compassion and self-care, and like, it's profoundly generous of her to share so many tools with us. And so I really recommend you check that out. And her book, you know, The Willpower Instinct. Yeah, Mirror of Intimacy. Thank you for mentioning that book as well. Do you think we'll ever eradicate our addiction, or rather it remains a vulnerable part of us, which we choose not to act upon? That's a great question. You know, for me, I think there's always going to be, you know, pain within me and within us that will need our attention, and we're going to get greater at responding to it in healthier ways throughout our life. I know for me, you know, my brain will never forget that sexual addiction, you know, was an exciting, pleasureful, you know, release. So I think we always have to be vigilant. You know, it's not like we stop being in recovery, but we can definitely get to a place where we are free. You know, we don't have it controlling our lives, and we really are creating a new life. I really believe in that, and that, to me, that's also part of self-connection, is, you know, stepping into the gifts that we have for the world, and you know, we can really kind of step into a different kind of life that we couldn't have when we were active in our addiction. So I hope that's helpful. All right. Well, if I missed any questions, please let me know. I am happy to stick around. All right. Well, it looks like people are done asking questions. And so, again, I'm just very grateful to be here with all of you. You can email me again at forrest@forrestbenedict.com. But yeah, I just wish all of you the best in your recovery. And thank you for this great opportunity to be with you. Take care.